Thank you, Melanie, and good evening to everyone. I'll start with the first speaker, who is Kathy Hessler, who is a clinical professor of law at Lewis and Clark Law School. She's also the director of the Animal Law Clinic and the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative. She also co-authored Animal Law in a Nutshell and Animal Law, New Perspectives on Teaching Traditional Law. The second speaker is Amy Wilson, who's a director and co-founder of Animal Law Reform South Africa. She is currently working as a fellow at the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative and the Animal Law Clinic at Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon. Special mention to Animal Law Reform South Africa, who is co-hosting this event with the Environmental Law Association, and we're so happy to be collaborating with them. And the third speaker is Prathna Singh, who's an animal rights activist and the director of Banned Animal Trading South Africa. She holds a Bachelor of Biological Sciences from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I'd also like to briefly expand on my background. Back in university, I co-founded an animal rights organization by the name of Saving Sentience Africa, with the aim of appealing to the larger demographic within South Africa, which is Black people, as there tends to be a racial stigma attached to animal rights. The groundwork I did in Saving Sentience Africa led to me writing my LLM thesis and proposing a meat tax. And that is why I'm so passionate about this topic and that we'll be discussing tonight. Over to you, Melanie.
Thanks so much, Tokyo. Tokyo was an absolutely amazing master's student and wrote a brilliant paper that's since been published about an innovative approach to regulating meat and introducing a meat tax. So it's really a privilege to be hosting this event with him. And so my job, very briefly, is to tell everyone a little bit about the film. Of course, the film is incredible. I hope you've all watched Seaspiracy, but if you haven't, please go and watch it. And yeah, let us know what you think on Facebook or anywhere else. The film, it tells the journey of this plastic activist or anti-plastic activist, I suppose, and that's how he starts. And he's quite has quite a simplistic approach to addressing pollution in the ocean and saving the sea. And in exploring that problem of plastic in the ocean, he uncovers how the crisis of exploitation of marine life in the ocean is a much bigger problem than plastic pollution. And that the fishing industry, in fact, contributes a huge amount towards plastic pollution in the ocean. And he exposes a whole range of really problematic practices, everything from slavery to illegal whaling, and a lot more in this journey that he goes on. Of course, it's a very male-centered perspective on an environmental problem, and also a very white perspective on an environmental problem. And so we can be critical of his approach. I kept thinking, like, his girlfriend is with him the entire time and we see her like once. and maybe that was something they decided together, and so, you know, it's none of my business. But I did think, like, you know, is this a complete perspective? But even though we can be critical of it, it's a valuable perspective. I learned so much from this movie. I did not know how harmful eating fish is to the ocean. I just, you know, I had thought about all the harm to the ocean, but that's happening, but not in that way, not in the way that me eating fish is contributing to it, because of the industrialized way in which fish is produced. And so we're here to talk about the film, and of course you don't want to listen to me blabber on about it. We have three experts, and we want to ask them some questions that they can share their insights with you. And the first question I'll hand over to Tokyo to ask. So hopefully that sets the scene.
Thank you, Melanie. The question is, given your respective areas of expertise, what impact stood out to you the most and why? I think we can start with Kathy when it comes to answering the question.
Thank you. And my thanks for the invitation to be here and working with you all, and for this wonderful panel that I'm on. I think that it's really wonderful to have an opportunity to talk about the film, both positively and critically. And that's, in fact, I think one of the most important impacts this film has had, is that it's provided a context for people to have these important conversations. And what it's done is rise to the conscious level and the visible level, information that is really difficult to convey in just words, right? So I've been teaching in this area for a number of years, and it's difficult to convey the staggering numbers of animals who are involved. It's the devastation of the aquatic life, of their habitats, of the ecosystems, really, really difficult to convey in just words. So I think the movie did a good job bringing that information to the fore so that we can talk about it. I also think that, as Melanie described, it was a journey. And I think it's nice sometimes to have a film without a point of view at the beginning, and to take people with you on that journey, because I think that opens the door to say, hey, we didn't have this information. We didn't know this. Why didn't we know this? So it doesn't make people feel stupid for not knowing these things. And it makes it easier for people to join that journey, to join that conversation. And so I think those are, to me, some of the most important aspects of the film.
No, thank you very much, Kathy. It was quite an insightful documentary. It touched on things that even I was not aware of myself. Thank you so much. And then on to Amy.
Great, thanks. So hi, everyone, and my thanks as well to the organizers for the event. I'm very happy to be here. I definitely acknowledge the criticisms of the film, and especially the perspectives that we've already raised, and I do agree with them. And I'm also going to echo some of the things that Kathy said. I really appreciate how the film contextualized many issues in a very digestible way for people who I don't actually believe had necessarily engaged with these before, and at least not necessarily aware of the scale in which it was happening. In our work, what we found is that people are misled and in fact actually deceived into thinking that their seafood is sustainable, is healthy, and is in many ways superior to other animal proteins. And I think the problem with that is these things are actually not true. We are misled, and the assumption that the law and government ensure that these issues are properly regulated is not happening, and they're happening in our backyard. So I'm also happy that many of the broader social impacts of our exploitation and use of animals were raised. You know, we're all interconnected. That's very important that we acknowledge and highlight that. Even for people who don't connect directly with animals, they don't have to be animal rights people. From a purely anthropocentric framing, we need to be educated about the impacts of livelihoods, the slavery issues, the worker safety, the small-scale fisher folk, all of that. And then finally, I think really one of the things that stuck out for me was the urgency of the situation. And I think that was important for people to acknowledge. It's not pie in the sky, right? You don't have to be an environmentalist to care about this. It's imperative to such a point that it's threatening our existence. And we can't just rely on the law and corporations to have accountability. We actually need to take personal responsibility and look at ourselves and our lives and how these impact on what's happening.
Oh, thank you, Amy. Yes, often when people speak of the meat industry and the impacts the meat industry has on the environment, often the fish industry is left out of the picture. So it is quite interesting to see how the documentary painted the picture with regard to how the impacts, the large scale impact that the fish industry does have. And then on to Prathna Singh.
Hi everyone. So for me, firstly, just in terms of the shock factor, I guess, I'd say working in the animal rights sort of perspective, for me, what was more of a shock was the human rights violations. I was aware that they were happening, but not the extent to which they were happening. So that was something that really stood out for me in the documentary. But similar to what Kathy and Amy said, what I thought was really good was the way so many different aspects were all tied together in terms of what the fishing industry actually affects. So if it's plastic pollution, if it's the killing of romantic species, if it's the destruction of coral reefs, all of that is linked to the fishing industry. And I think a lot of the public is not aware of that link. So that was what really stood out for me in the documentary. And just on a personal level, I think this is probably the first documentary that I've seen where leaving marine animals off your plate is a key solution to saving the ocean, which that was really cool.
Thank you, Prathna. Yes, the documentary certainly did paint a grand picture with regard to how slavery, how the fish industry is linked to what takes place within human society. And then on to Melanie. She also has a few questions to ask.
Great, thanks so much. Our first question is to Kathy, and it relates to the fact that Seaspiracy reveals that fish and other animals in the ocean are sentient beings. A lot of pescatarians justify the choice to continue eating fish and not meat on the basis that this isn't the case. And the film had quite a strong message about this. Could you explain the significance of this revelation from the perspective of an animal law expert?
Yes, thank you. I think it's one of the most fundamental questions, because when we don't accept, know, or understand that animals in general, aquatic animals in particular, have sentience, then we don't have legal or moral obligations to prevent harm to those animals. If we don't think they can feel pain, then we don't have to worry about causing them pain. And so that information underlies, whether we know it or not, and the lack of that information, our legal decision-making as well as our moral and ethical decision-making. So we have, I think, a duty to look at this information to find out what we're doing and whether it causes harm. So we have to ask ourselves that questions. And then I think we have a duty to go back and adjust our legal regimes to take that scientific information into account. And it's not just sentience. So sentience being the idea that animals can feel and can feel pain and can therefore suffer. But the capacities of these animals more broadly need to be taken into account. And we have an awful lot of scientific data that hasn't been incorporated into legal or policy decision-making, and that needs to happen. And so once we think about not just not causing them pain or suffering, we have to actually even think about what suffering might mean when we realize and recognize what their capacities actually are. So just for example, if we know that certain animals stay with their mothers for years and they receive food and cultural information necessary for their survival, then we shouldn't allow for the separation of those animals from their mothers, right? Because that does damage to those individuals, to those family groups, and to the species certainly as a whole. So fundamentally, science, this new scientific information, it's not completely new, right? It's that we're paying attention to it, but there are a lot of recent studies that take us further than most people know. So understanding the science helps us understand, hopefully, that these animals have value in and of themselves, right? So we tend to look at them as resources. We tend to look at them as tools, right? And even in the environmental protection context, we tend to look at them as resources that we want to manage and conserve for the benefit of the species or for the benefit of the environment. But the science helps us understand these are individuals who have biological and psychological and emotional realities that we should start paying attention to. So I think that's a really important thing. And once we begin to also stop using the human capacities as a default for measuring value in other animals, right? So just because an animal can't think or see or act or move in the way that we can, doesn't mean they're less valuable. We need to actually appreciate their capacities, recognize they have capacities we don't have. And then once we have a better view of what those capacities are, then the law should take that into account and figure out how to protect those animals and their ability to engage in those capacities. And if we build that understanding into the way we limit or ban or restrict our ability to interfere with animals, we'll be protecting those animals and their environments and the ecosystems. And that's what we should be working towards. Oh.
Thanks. That was such a comprehensive answer. We have a couple more questions for you, if that's all right. And the next one is, And just while you were speaking, I was thinking about that scene of where the fish were watching another fish get beaten and how they reacted. And then I realized, like, judging, getting emotional about that is applying this human understanding of feeling. So I'm like making the mistake that we're not supposed to make while I'm watching. But you can't help it in a way.
And before you ask your next question, if you don't mind me jumping in, I think having empathy is a good thing. I actually think when we talk about legal regulation, we try to take away that emotional connection to the rest of the world. And that's problematic, whether it's, you know, our empathy for people or for animals or for the planet. So I think that empathy is well placed. And I think we can do it in lots of different ways. So I don't think you should feel badly for that.
Thank you. Well, our next question is a little bit more legal. It's about how Seaspiracy reveals a number of challenges in regulating what's arguably inherently unsustainable industrial scale fishing practices in the high seas. And these include everything from the inability to enforce laws prohibiting bycatch to the practice of slavery being part of fishing. So what are some of the key international laws that regulate industrial scale fishing in the high seas? And what are some of the ways in which these international laws should reform to address the problems exposed by the film?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I'm going to do sort of a broad approach to it because we could spend lots of time on it, and we don't have a lot of time. So first, I would say that seeing animals, again, as resources and as unending resources, which has been the approach we've taken, that they're unlimited, right? And so that we haven't really needed, you know, going back in human history, we haven't worried about depleting these stocks. And sometimes like, okay, so we deplete that stock, we'll move on to a different species and we'll fish that species. And so that mindset needs to change, and it's built into the laws that I'm gonna address right now. So I'm just gonna list some of the laws that exist, and then I'll talk about problems a little more generally. So we have the Convention on the Law of the Sea. We have UN Fish Stocks Agreement. We have the FAO, which is the Food Agriculture Organization, Code for Responsible Fisheries. We have the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling. We have an agreement to promote, an international agreement to promote the compliance with international conservation and management measures by fishing vessels on the high seas. We have the Reykjavik Declaration on Responsible Fisheries in the Marine Ecosystem, the Agreement on Port State Measures to Prevent, Deter, and Eliminate Illegal, Unreported, and Unregulated Fishing. We have FAO international plans of action on seabirds for incidental catch, on sharks for conservation and management, on fishing capacity management, and on IUU fishing, on combating that. We have sustainable development goals, goal 14 of which is the conservation and sustainable use of oceans and the proper management of living and non-living resources in the oceans. There are organizations focusing on speaking to these laws and sort of helping manage them. We have, you know, groups like Greenpeace and so forth. We have the IUCN Fisheries and Aquaculture Organization, the FAO Fisheries and Aquaculture Department, the UN Division for Ocean Affairs and Law of the Sea, and the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas. And then we have regional fisheries management, both instruments about how fisheries should be managed and organizations to help manage those instruments, right? And South Africa in particular is a member of a number of these, right? So the Committee for Inland Fisheries and Aquaculture of Africa, the Southwest Indian Ocean Fisheries Commission, the Southeast Atlantic Fisheries Organization, the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, the Commission for the Conservation of the Southern Bluefin Tuna, and the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, just to name some. And then there's also the Africa Program for Fisheries run by the World Bank, Lake Victoria Fisheries Organization, so other things that are more Pan-African as well. Then we also have customary international law relating to fisheries regulation, right? So we have this customary law in addition to some of the laws that I've just mentioned. We also have two court bodies, the International Court of Justice and the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. Okay. So that's a lot. And you would think, wow, this should be managed really, really well. And we know that that's not the case. And that's not the case for a number of reasons. So first, any international agreement, treaty, law isn't enforceable or can't come into effect, first of all, unless countries agree to it, right? Unless they become parties to it. And then they need to pass domestic legislation and to implement and enforce those standards. And that's not happening as much as we'd like it to happen. Additionally, we have some significant enforcement issues. We're talking about territory that is really, really difficult to manage because it's not static, it's very far away. It takes a lot of resources to try and manage the enforcement and who's doing it, when it's being done, how it's being done. We have lots of questions about that. So for instance, we also don't have poachers, right, signing on to these treaties. So they should be regulated by it, but they're not a party to it. And they're just kind of, doing what they want to do. We also know that the economic interests are really, really high. And so we even have states that have a significant incentive to circumvent the rules, right, to cheat, even when they are parties to these treaties or agreements. So we have a significant amount of pragmatic issues trying to enforce it. We also don't have a static population we're trying to manage, regulate, or protect, right? So the animals are moving through territories across jurisdictions, and that makes it also very difficult to figure it out. We also don't know exactly what happens. Sometimes we can't always predict when we push really hard to enforce one of these treaties. So there's been international pressure on Japan, again, just as an example, to stop using the research exemption on the whaling ban. And so after receiving pressure for a lot of time from a lot of people, Japan withdrew from the convention and said, okay, fine, right? We're just gonna not be regulated by that anymore. And we're gonna be able to do all the whaling we want in our own territory without having to worry about that international framework. That I don't think was the intended consequence. And so trying to figure out how to maneuver through the geopolitical conversations, as well as the environmental and animal welfare concerns that we're trying to manage, it's a really, really challenging environment in which to work. And so I think we want people to sort of understand that I guess my sort of takeaway would be that we can't rely entirely on these instruments and these frameworks to achieve the goals that we want to. We need to continue to work on them, continue to try to implement them and improve them. And I would suggest continue to change the fundamental acceptance that we should be using these animals as resources, and we should be using them up to the point where they're the stock is no longer sustainable, right? That's just really problematic framework for regulation. But I think if we begin to help people, as the movie did, begin to understand that people are part of this conversation too, and their consumer choices can make a difference, and that we need to work towards alternatives, and we're moving in that direction really, really quickly. And that I think also needs to be factored into the legal conversation about what we still allow when we have less harmful alternatives available. So I know that's a sort of higher level approach, but hopefully that's responsive to your question.
Thank you so much. Yes. And it's remarkable how much law there is, and it shows how the law is something that's fundamentally inadequate in dealing with these big issues. But all we can hope is that changing laws might contribute to changing human behavior. Our last question for Kathy relates to food labeling practices. And this was something that came through really strongly in the film, how people's impressions of fishing practices are tainted, or we're misled really by the fishing industry. And the idea that something might be dolphin safe or shark safe or sustainable fishing. And in fact, these labels are given fairly gratuitously. So the question is, how are food labeling practices in the fishing industry bound up, and how should the law change to address the problematic and opportunistic use of labels like dolphin friendly?
Yeah, labeling is a problem across the board, not just in this area, but in other areas. And so fundamentally, I think we have an idea that we allow for, we give companies, organizations, people who want to advertise a lot of leeway to not be 100% accurate, right? So here in the US, we call that puffery. And so we are allowing people to puff up their products and to enhance them in ways that might not be completely accurate. And so that's a problematic starting point. So what I think we need to do is begin to push for more truth in advertising and focus more on materially misleading, right, information, and show that consumers really are relying on this information to make consumer choices. And so that's very problematic. So I think we need to work a little bit harder on giving regulatory meaning to some of these words. Here in the US, we have legal definitions for some of the words that are used, like organic. We could argue that it's not regulated well and the meaning is not what people anticipate it to mean, but at least it has some legally enforceable standards, right? And other words like natural or free range don't have any. And that's very, very problematic because, again, consumers think they have meaning, think that they're actually buying a certain kind of product that's been produced or sourced or developed in a certain way. And it turns out that that's not the case. So, and there have been studies done to show that consumers are willing to pay more when they think animals aren't harmed, right? When they think environmental practices are observed. So we know that consumers are making conscious choices to the best of their ability. And so we need to change the laws so that we can help them make those choices with accurate information. And right now that's problematic. So I'll just say really quickly that people should note where the sources of labeling come from. So is it a government regulation? Is it a third-party certification, which was discussed in the movie, or is it an industry certification? So we have 3 different sources and really different kind of conversations for each of those 3.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I actually hadn't thought of the source of the labeling as being part of the problem. So yeah, I hope that sheds some light for people listening as well. So we do have some questions coming through. Kathy will consider whether they're directed at her and respond to them while we deal with the next set of questions, and I'll hand over to Tokyo to ask those.
Thank you, Melanie. My next set of questions are aimed towards Amy. The first question being, what are some of the ways in which South African law regulates fishing, and how should the domestic laws of South Africa respond to the impacts of fishing on the oceans? Is it fair to say the existing laws facilitate the over-exploitation of marine life?
Great, so there's a lot in there, and I think, as been alluded to, as a fundamental start, I think it's useful to note that all animals, as well as nature, are considered legally as property. And this underlying status essentially allows for their use and exploitation. In South Africa specifically, there are a large number of different laws and policies that regulate and impact on fishing in the country and within our exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, and outside of that. The main or predominant piece of legislation is the Marine Living Resources Act from 1998. And the regulations. And then, of course, this works as part of the broader context where we consider the Supreme Constitution, other laws that regulate the environment, biodiversity, threatened and protected species and areas, and various other issues. And this regulation happens at different levels, from national to provincial, and then, of course, international law that we spoke about too, as it's adopted domestically. For me, it's really apparent from the name of the Act, the Marine Living Resources Act, that the non-human animals who are the subjects of the law are clearly considered as mere resources. And this definitely affects how people view them more broadly and how they treat it, as Kathy's touched on. It also should be coupled with the right to environment, which has been interpreted very widely by government, particularly the use of the term sustainable use, which has had devastating consequences both for terrestrial and aquatic wildlife. So what the Marine Living Resources Act does is sets out a number of provisions regulating fishing, and this is through the granting of fishing rights, issuing of permits and licenses for certain activities, restrictions on kinds of activities, the way you can fish, the gear you can use, the ships, all that sorts of things. And then it designates criminal offenses and penalties in terms of that, and then obviously administrative matters like most legislation does. And what happens with these designated quotas, they're then determined in terms of a total allowable catch or a total applied effort. And they are then allocated to specific people, to specific species and specific jurisdictions. And that is really how the fishing is regulated. And this includes foreign enterprises, commercial enterprises, small-scale fisheries, and people generally. Then in addition to this legal context, there's obviously a huge number of illegal activities going on. And then there's all these additional pressures on these animals and the environment from other human activities that are happening. So all of these actually compound together. it's really kind of tough to answer the question about what the law should do. So obviously the law is a mechanism to achieve various goals that we're trying to achieve. So on the one hand, we have providing jobs, supporting livelihoods, supporting commercial activities, trying to bolster our economy, food security. Kathy's already spoken about the SDGs. So all of those we have to take into account for our ever-increasing human population. And then we have all the complex environmental considerations and goals, and then the trillions of aquatic animals that are involved. In the South African context, we're also trying to deal with consequences and the legacies of our sordid past. So we're trying to deal with transformation and all these additional issues of access for previously disadvantaged groups. But generally, I would say domestic laws need to be more proactive. They've definitely been reactive, and I don't believe they're holistic. They don't go far enough in recognizing the tremendous value that our oceans have, including for climate change. As the film mentioned a number of times, this is critical, right? So if we truly looked at that, we would incorporate it more tangibly into our regulation and policies, and, you know, take the precautionary approach. But one specific reform I'll say that is absolutely key and essential is the designation of marine and other protected areas. This is absolutely essential for animals to recover and allow nature a chance to properly reproduce. And we've only just started doing this properly in South Africa. And then also one positive thing we started doing is the allocation of more smaller scale fishing rights. So that will obviously take away from some of the commercialized operations.
No, thank you very much for that answer, Amy. Clearly, South Africa has a long way to go with regard to their laws and the perception that their laws bring about when it concerns non-human animals. The next question I have is, in Seaspiracy, fishing is described as large-scale and legally sanctioned wildlife poaching, given that fish are part of a living ecosystem. Do you agree with this statement? How are fishing from the ocean and the meat industry different in this respect? How are they the same?
Great, so it's a great question and it raises a lot of different issues. I'm going to try and touch on them and can expand on them if necessary. But by its very definition, poaching is an illegal activity. So we have to differentiate legal and illegal. Just because something is legal also doesn't necessarily make it morally, ecologically, or otherwise right. And the converse is also true. Just because something is illegal doesn't necessarily make it morally or ecologically or otherwise wrong. In the terrestrial animal context, I think it's a good example to look at trophy hunting and poaching. So, for example, someone from another country can come to South Africa, pay a huge amount of money and kill, say, a lion, and they do that legally because they've obtained a permit. So they've paid for that permit, they receive it, and that's the government stamp of approval. The very same activity is done by, for example, a local person. The same lion can be the same place, whatever it is. That is an illegal activity, and that is poaching. And the differentiating factor is that piece of paper or that permit. And it's the same when it comes to aquatic animals for abalone, right? Abalone is poached, it's fished, and it's farmed, and the difference is the government stamp of approval. When we're looking at comparing the meat industry and the fishing industries, the main difference is obviously that fishing is taking wild animals from the wild, and the meat industry is specifically breeding animals intensively and utilizing and killing them. So they're domestic animals. Although in South Africa, we farm wild animals on a mass scale as well. The major overlaps with the fishing industry and the meat industry is essentially that they're both premised on the notion of mass exploitation of billions of sentient animal lives for protein, and that they also have devastating impacts on animals, humans, and the environment. But I will say the meat industry in terms of farming is much more equivalent to the burgeoning aquaculture industry, which is mentioned in the film. Aquaculture is the farming of aquatic species, and this industry essentially has many of the same negative impacts as industrialized animal terrestrial culture, but it also raises a number of other harmful issues. All of these industries really essentially fail to account for the externalities that they cause, and the law sanctions them. So from an international perspective, we have foreign fishing vessels coming to South African and African territories and taking our resources, if you will. And similarly for the meat industry, we see them outsourcing these activities to Africa, such as factory farming. And in that way, they are taking them out of their hands and they're putting that problem on us. And our society is the one that pays the price. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the documentary itself, I'd say the very same people, many of them also made a predecessor documentary called Cowspiracy, and that deals with a lot of the terrestrial animal agricultural issues, if anyone is interested in that.
Yes, thank you, Amy. That was a very good answer. The documentary certainly raised a lot of key issues that people tend to focus on when discussing the meat industry with regard to domestic animals, as you stated, with regard to Cowspiracy and how it's comparable to Seaspiracy. And just the final question I have is, Seaspiracy illustrates how industrialized fishing has had major social justice implications for local small-scale farming communities. And this is equally the case in South Africa, as illustrated, for instance, in the over-exploitation litigation. What law reform would you suggest in response?
Good question. It's a hard question. And I think, yeah, the impact of the larger scale commercial operations is enormous and it must be properly considered. I also think it is really important that people understand the differentiation between industrialized commercial fishing and small scale fisheries. They are very different and they bring about different contexts, right? It's very important in South Africa, looking at our history. This case was very relevant because of the issue of customary law. It's also not actually dissimilar to what's happening in the USA with the fishing rights of the Native Americans, right? And they've been granted certain rights in terms of treaties, and now they're being impacted by these mass industrialized operations, and they're not able to take the rights that are allocated to them. So as I mentioned, it's been positive that there's been a push recently in government to grant more small-scale fishing through longer rights and things like that. So we're moving away, at least in some ways, from that commercialized industrial fishing. I really think we need to tackle the issue of foreign entities fishing in our waters legally and illegally. And also enforcement is a key issue, right? Targeting these illegal activities that are happening. And then I mentioned the protected areas. So all of these in combination, I think, will assist in protecting the rights of smaller scale fishing operations to allow them to actually flourish and take full advantage of them. Another thing that needs to happen is that the negative impacts of the industrial fishing should not be externalized. We need responsibility and accountability for the people that are causing this harm. They can't push it onto other people. It must be paid for by the party. So that kind of liability element. And then Kathy mentioned this, but I do think really as a final proposal, we truly need to start research, development, and investing in alternatives to animal protein. It's very concerning that we are continuing to promote harmful industries that are not sustainable. So even by giving people these rights, we're essentially setting them up for failure longer term in some respects, right? We have to look at other opportunities and start making these more feasible and accessible on a mass scale. And I think that's where we'll really empower people and our society longer term.
Thank you very much, Amy. And I see that we're running low on time. So Melanie, I'll pass over to you because I believe you have more questions to ask.
I have questions for Prathna, who is a director at Ban Animal Trading, and so brings a very unique perspective to this law discussion. And also it's wonderful to have a scientist at a law discussion. So our first question is, Seaspiracy exposes some of the links between animal trading and the fishing industry, for instance, the whaling and shark fin industries. Could you explain these links to us and some of the problems associated with animal trading?
Okay, so in terms of the documentary, you see a lot of species being killed due to bycatch, like sharks, whales, dolphins, turtles. But the animal trade is also responsible for killing a lot of species linked to the fishing industry. Like you mentioned, the whaling and the shark finning, because animal trade is not just the trade in living animals, but it's also the trade of animal parts, animal products. So the trade in whale meat for consumption, the trade of shark fins, that's all obviously linked to the fishing industry. And that is a link with the animal trade, but also in terms of the marine animal entertainment industry, where live animals are traded, like dolphins, are captured around the world in numerous countries and transported to dolphinariums and aquariums to be used in dolphin shows and swim with dolphin programs and that sort of thing. In terms of the pet trade, we have fish that are captured. Sometimes the methods are completely horrendous. Some of them involve using sodium cyanide, where solutions are sprayed into the water where the shoals of fish are to stun the fish so that they are more easily captured. Often the fish don't survive, and the ones that do are then shipped into the pet trade. But not only does that decimate populations, but it destroys coral reefs as well. You've got turtles that are not only endangered because of their habitat loss, but also because of the pet trade. We've got animals like the vaquita. It's the smallest living cetacean. And because of medicinal uses, there's an animal called the totoaba bass in the Gulf of California that is hunted for its swim bladder. And the vaquita is roughly the same size, so it gets caught in the gill nets. So in that way, animals that are traded for medicinal uses are also impacting other marine life. Horseshoe crabs are another example of animals that are traded for medicinal purposes. So there are many, many examples of animals, marine animals that are traded for a variety of reasons and exploited by people. And at the end of the day, it's the fact that as much as we can say, governments can say that these practices are regulated in terms of the fishing industry and in terms of the animal trade, we know without a doubt that these are not regulated, and that is causing the decimation of many, many marine species. You've also got bodies like CITES who are supposed to be keeping a closer eye on these things, but animals are only added to their lists to be protected when they're already endangered, they're already in trouble. So yeah, those are some of the problems.
Thanks so much. I'll move on quickly to the next question so that you can share with us your views. Seaspiracy's closing message is that each of us should, if we want to help save the ocean, significantly reduce or completely cut out our fish consumption. Do you agree with this? Do you think that that's realistic? Do you think this kind of industrialized fishing should be worked out of the system? And what are some of the other ways in which environmental law students, lawyers, academics, and others that are with us today, or animal rights activists, can be better so as to protect the oceans?
So yes, from an animal rights perspective, I absolutely think that we should cut marine mammals out of our diets. We shouldn't be eating fish at all. In terms of how we can be better activists, it's quite a broad topic. There are lots. We do believe that activism is most effective in a multifaceted approach. There are many different ways to perform your activism, and different strategies work for different scenarios. We've also found that for specific campaigns, multi-pronged approaches are most effective. And then in terms of the documentary, there were so many different issues that were touched upon that different issues are going to appeal to different people. So wherever your interests lie, wherever your activism lies, there are going to be people that you are going to make an impact on and have an effect on. And as long as that activism is impactful and credible, I would say the first thing to do is to really educate yourself so that you are a credible, reliable source of information, and then motivate people to make a change. On a personal level, obviously the best thing to do would be switching to a plant-based diet, but also doing things on your own, like attending beach cleanups, things like that. In a group setting, you could attend protests, sign petitions if they are relevant to your specific issue, and then obviously from a more legal perspective, it would be the lobbying and the changing of laws, which is also so important. And I think that's how activists and lawyers can work together to really, really facilitate change. Yeah.
And the last question is should we be working towards a ban on industrialized fishing? Is this realistic? What are your closing thoughts on this?
So again, from an animal rights perspective, I absolutely do think there should be a ban on industrialized fishing. As we've seen in the documentary, sustainability is a farce. So there is no way of knowing that the fish that you are eating has been caught sustainably, that a non-target species has not been killed when catching the fish that you are eating. There's no way of knowing that. And if by some miracle the fishing industry was able to regulate their practices and completely eliminate human rights violations and ensure that there was no commercial fishing in marine protected areas, and even if all of that happened, you would still be killing bycatch, you would still be killing the whales and the dolphins and the sharks and the turtles. And I think it was the Faroese whaler that mentioned, besides that, the value of a life of a whale is the same as the value of the life of a fish. So whether or not you're killing the whale and the shark and the dolphin, you're still killing that fish. And studies have shown that fish are sentient beings. They feel pain, they feel fear, they feel suffering, they have complex social bonds. There is no reason for us to be eating them. It's not essential to human survival. And it's just, industrialized fishing is just not necessary. If you add that on top of everything we've seen in the documentary, on top of the environmental impacts and the human impacts and the other animal impacts, there's just no reason for industrialized fishing to continue.
While I've got the floor, I'm going to ask a question that's arising a little bit from the chat, is the difference between, and they do show this a bit in the movie, people who are fishing to survive and those livelihoods being threatened by industrialized fishing, who are not doing it to survive, but who are doing it to obviously make massive profits. And so do you think that emphasis should be on industrialized fishing rather than the small scale fishers that are genuinely trying to survive?
Sorry, is this a question for me? So I think the big industrialized fishing industry is probably the more pressing issue and the one that needs to be targeted. They're having the biggest and most detrimental impact on the oceans and on the animals. Again, from an animal rights perspective, we do believe that nobody should be eating animals. I do understand that it's a lot more of a complex issue in terms of subsistence fishing and that sort of thing, in comparison to industrialized fishing. So I think industrialized fishing would be the main target for now.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much. So we've got quite a few questions, and of course we're open to people raising their hand and raising questions as well at this point. We have about 5 minutes for questions. The speakers have been answering questions as we go along. I'd be interested to hear from any of the speakers who feel they'd like to respond on shifting the discourse and maybe the paradigm of our law from sustainability to sufficiency, and whether this might be helpful. Perhaps we could start with Kathy and then Amy and then Prathna on this point.
I think that would be a useful shift, but I think if I'm living in a dream world, I would go even further, and I would say, let's start from the basis that we shouldn't be using life, however we define that. And so we should be finding alternatives. We should be defining, developing, as Amy said, using those alternatives and having that be the starting point. And I think if we understand that animals are sentient, and I think all animals are sentient in one way or another, that we should change the burden of proof and say, you have to explain why this use that you're suggesting we should engage in isn't harmful or is somehow leading to sufficiency, right? And I think that would answer some of the questions for tribal or indigenous or small scale operations. And people could say, well, we don't have access to those alternatives right now, and so this is what we need to do to live. And so the answer would either be, we'll give you access to those alternatives, or yes, you can use those methodologies until you have access. And that's part of our role as a community, is to help give you access and to recognize, obviously, your right to live, right? And your right to sustain yourselves and your communities and your cultures. And then also our responsibility as a whole community, right, to have these larger conversations and understand that everyone's contributing to the harm. I absolutely agree that the industrial scale, if we stop that at once, we would have a lot more breathing room to give us time to address some of these other adaptations. But I think I would go further than just going with sufficiency.
Amy?
Great. Yeah, I mean, definitely in an ideal world, I think maybe efficiency. I think as we are evolving as society, you know, we're learning consistently how to do things better, and, you know, have the opportunity to learn from the mistakes of our past. So with the development of technology, I really think technology is going to be the thing that ends up saving us. I also think it's because of technology that we are in the position that we're in. So it's kind of a circular thing. The problem with the sustainability thing is it's not defined, right? It's not defined in any tangible way for us to understand. And as I mentioned, as it comes to the South African Constitution, and specifically Section 24, we throw the word around. We're like sustainable utilization. It's very apparent that it isn't sustainable. So unless we have a really clear metric to define sustainability, I think it's problematic. It's not impossible, but as of right now, I think it's causing a lot of problems. So when people throw that word sustainable around it, it kind of makes me irk a little bit, because I don't believe that what we're doing is currently sustainable.
Thanks. Prathna, do you have anything to add on this point?
No, nothing. I think they've covered it perfectly. Yeah.
Thanks. Something that occurred to me while people were speaking is, you know, the argument, I don't necessarily agree or disagree. I don't want to disclose my view that, you know, animals eat other animals, and humans are animals. And so, you know, and even though animals are sentient, you know, they eat each other. And so is it because we are special that we should stop doing that? Prathna, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
I'd like to say, you know, we often say when we know better, we do better. Not that we know better, but if we can evolve and progress as a society in so many different ways, in terms of our technology, in terms of everything that humans as a species do, why can we not progress to the point where we're eating without causing any harm or any pain or any suffering to another animal? If we can put people on the moon, if we can, you know, discover what's at the bottom of the ocean, why can we not eat in a way that is ethically and morally correct? That's doing no harm to others, and that is just as healthy and just as beneficial to us and better for the environment. And I mean, I wouldn't want to get onto the overpopulation issue, but in terms of the amount of people on the planet, it's not sustainable to be eating animals the way we do. And that is a whole other discussion. I know we don't have time for it, but, you know, lions are not overpopulating the earth. So when they're eating other animals, yeah, I'm not going to say the word sustainable, but they are, you know, everything is right the way it's supposed to be. With humans, we have far too many people on the planet eating far too many animals. The way in which we farm the animals is incorrect. The land usage, the water usage, the environmental impacts, the list goes on. It's just, you cannot compare the way humans eat animals to the way animals eat animals. It's a completely different ballgame.
Thanks so much. I think you said it so well. There's quite a lot of chat in the chat about NEMA, sustainable development, and South African law. Amy, would you be able to respond to that in about a minute, and then we'll close up and we'll do some thank yous very briefly.
Sure, I have a minute to solve the world's problems. No, I'm kidding. I think, yeah, so as I understand the definition in NEMA for sustainable development, and the reference to it is to future generations. And I actually think that's a very good way to look at it, right? That's what's in the Constitution. We're talking about the preservation for future generations. The way that we're currently doing it, we don't have much to hand over to future generations. As somebody who's a woman of childbearing age, I am not feeling confident that I have something to hand over for future generations beyond myself. So I think that might be a very good way to frame the discussion and the conversation around what is sustainable. Yeah, we're not going to make all the answers today, but I think we definitely need to consider future generations as interested stakeholders in their own right. So not just looking at who we are presently as a population and our rights to take things now and this, immediate gratification that our society lives on. Let's look at our future generations and consider them as stakeholders with rights to all the different resources that we have.
Great, thanks. Tokyo, any last words from your side?
No last words. This was a very enlightening discussion.
Great. I see Kathy has added to the comments about how we eat and what we eat, and that's really helpful. So please do read through that. I know that meat eating and fish eating is such a big thing in South Africa, and it's very much embedded in us. But documentaries like this ask us to question that culture and way of life, and ask us to consider whether it's natural and whether it's possible for us to live a different life. I'm going to hand over now to Ali, who's going to very quickly do some thank yous and also award our book prize.
Yeah. So before we get into thanks, like Mel says, we ran a book competition for our members in which we asked them the question, should animal trading be banned? Wow, my England today, guys. And why or why not? And today's winner, drumroll, is Melissa. Melissa had the most comprehensive answer, so I'm not going to read it all, but I do want to highlight some of the points. So she said there's several factors that are relevant in considering which trades should be banned and the priority and rate at which the bans should be approached. First, the level of impacts and cruelty with a particular industry should be considered and rated according to priority. Second, the practices should be economic and social impacts should be considered. Thirdly, strategic low-hanging fruit amendments that may better regulate particular trades and which could provide a phasing out regime should be identified. And fourthly, an assessment of enforcement capacity is required to inform the pace at which transitions could occur and the capacity of it being enforced or unenforceable. And finally, priority or practical ratings should inform the precedents with which a particular ban, stricter regulation, or phase out should be approached and lobbied with legislatures. In an ideal world, we may have a total ban on animal trading. However, human history has involved exploiting animals for over millennia, and reversing these practices will take time. So thank you very much, Melissa, for your amazing contribution. And your answer was really, really good. So you will be getting a copy of the 2020 edition of Animal Law in a Nutshell. So congratulations, Melissa. And then if you want to be a member and take part in our competitions during the streaming club, there's lots of other benefits, networking opportunities, places to present, please head over to our website, elasa.co.za, and just follow the links. Everything you need to know, including all the benefits, are there for you. And then on to our note of thanks. Firstly, thanks to our collaborators tonight, Animal Law Reform South Africa, and to our honorable speakers, Kathy, Amy, and Prathna. Thank you guys so much. We really enjoyed your contributions. You generated an engaging conversation that we really all enjoyed. I had so many questions in the chat. I couldn't keep up with you guys. So thank you so much. And then thank you to our amazing hosts, Tokyo and Melissa. You guys are awesome. And thank you for such a thought-provoking session. And then also thanks to our XCOM members who are here tonight. And a special thanks to Mel again and to Kate for organizing these streaming club events. And then finally, thanks to you, our amazing members and friends of the ELA who are in the audience tonight. Without you, these events are not going to be, or aren't what they could be without the engaging conversations that you guys bring to every single session. So if you want to join us, we have these sessions on most last Thursdays of the month. So just keep a lookout on our Facebook page or our social media pages for upcoming events. And with that, oh yes, one more thing. If you thought this was a conversation worth sharing, please send your friends and family or yourselves, if you thought you want to listen to this back, to our YouTube channel where we'll have the recording of this available to you. And with that, I bid you all farewell on this very cold evening, and please stay safe out there, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks so
Bye,
much.
everyone.